you so much for your inspiring talk. I'm kind of still processing the image of the 2 meter apart tango. And while I'm doing this, I would like to remind our dear audience to send in questions using the Q&A tool you will find on the bottom of your screen. Please use this to send in your questions to Erica Burman. And while everybody's doing that, it's my privilege of asking the first one myself. So we've been talking at this conference so far about the past and the future and the status quo we call the lockdown. So the continuously looking back in order to continue oriented towards our future. And you mentioned the same way we are now looking back on our pre-lockdown lives, we might look back on the lockdown. So I liked your questions, what are we waiting for? Like, are we waiting for Godot or going back to normal or for a revolution to come? And you referred to a Laurie Anderson song, and in The Dream before it says like history is an angel being blown backwards into the future, right? And this angel wants to go back and wants to desperately repair things. And I currently often have the feeling we are behaving like this is a hurricane or a flood. And after it will be over soon. And we will inspect the damage and we'll collect the debris. There will be people injured and there will be a death toll. But after that, we will be the same again. And my question is, how do we prepare ourselves for the potential sudden realization that there might be more discontinuity alongside, as you mentioned, the free floating of capital, new austerity measures that will stay in place on a long-term run, not only right now. So will we need to find other forms of protests? Will we just wear masks, or how do we socially distance ourselves while marching the streets or being with the nearish and dearish?
I don't know the answers to those questions, Irene, but I do think we have to start thinking about them in the sense that we're not going to go back. And what lies ahead looks like it could be even more frightening than what we're in now. Well, we may look back and wish we'd thought more now to prepare for what is going to happen next. And, you know, I can't do that thinking on my own. That's why I want to be with other people to think about this. I truly believe that thinking is a joint activity. However, you know, I think the act of, you know, I've written this talk to and write myself out of that position of paralysis. Hence, I was called by your invitation, the invitation of this conference, and my anticipation of being able to speak with others beyond the confines of my home and beyond a single Zoom window, because we're all zoomed out, aren't we? To think and reflect and prepare and organize anew, really. And, you know, people are doing socially distanced rallies and mobilizations. I showed an image of one in my talk. So no answers, but good question.
Thank you. There is a question from Robert I would like to read to you. There's something oppressive about vision. Racialization, for example, wouldn't be possible without perception, which of course is fundamental to psychology. I wonder if you can say something about the politics of speaking and listening and the liberatory potential as alternatives to vision.
The politics of speaking and
listening. And the liberatory potential. So as alternatives to vision, what you were talking about.
I do agree, and I'm not usually one to champion vision. I mean, vision is the mode associated with appropriative modernity. But it's interesting that it has emerged as so central to these accounts of the construction of subjectivity. And I think, and it's obviously been quite resonant for me just now, I mean, the politics of speaking and listening go along with the politics of silence and being silenced, just as vision is about what is not seen and overlooked and rendered invisible, as much as it is what is rendered too visible or marked in specific ways, as in racialization. So obviously, in a Lacanian account, the vision is, I mean, it's not only about vision. In the group analytic version, vision kind of is important, and partly because it's tied to a kind of more of a modern metaphysics of presence, in a way that group analysts have been severely challenged by in the move to online therapy, it has to be said. But again, I think it's, I mean, you can't say the senses are analogous. They all have their distinct specificity. So the politics of speaking and listening are, of course, very important, but what happens with vision is distinct in its own right, and I think we have to think about that. I think that's one way of answering your question, but there's obviously a lot more to think about there.
Maybe as a follow-up question, because it fits nicely, and some of you have already touched upon, a question as Alfonso has sent in. Since vision is a sensory perception that cannot be replaced by the totality of our other senses, what would be the greater impact of downgrading sight perception for epistemological sight, which emphasizes empathy and care? By going deeper into our minds, to go deeper into the other, do we lose anything from visual sight that could be more insightful than empathetic retreat? And then saying, I'm deliberating on how the subject is caught between things lost in sight perception and things lost through internal empathizing.
Oh, that's a very interesting reflection. I mean, in the longer version of this paper, or I might have taken it out in its earlier versions, you know, I started out as a cognitive scientist, can you believe it? Studying developmental psychology at a moment when it was very aligned with the cognitive science. And at that point, all the artificial intelligence was focused around visual recognition to do guided missiles, all the military applications. So I've been deeply hostile to vision as a metaphor for subjectivity, even as also the stupidity of the assumptions grounding those early models were made manifest in the sense that they failed. I mean, it's relevant for my theme here. They failed to take account of the fact that, you know, eyes are in bodies. Well, there are two eyes, the head moves, eyes are in bodies and the body moves and people move around together. So, so the kind of idealist solipsistic model that vision in modernity has come to occupy has kind of deconstructed itself. How that, I mean, where we take that in terms of ideas about empathy, I mean, of course, feminist approaches have kind of tried to champion, I suppose, the listening and the feeling and the affect. I think the idea of vision as capture has been very, very powerful. But what I was trying to get at is how vision secures some of our fantasies about the other, even imagined, imagined images, and that it's important to reflect on that too.
Thank you. Michael Bamberg has a question. He firstly says, thanks so much, Erica, truly enlightening. What threw me was your quote, we dig ourselves into ever bigger psychic holes. Yes, we do. But the offers of the ever-growing self-help industry are so seductive. Could you comment? Why is this industry so successful?
Oh, it's tempting to make some really flippant comments, isn't it? I meant psychic holes without the W, H-O-L-E-S, holes as in an abyss, yes? And the self-help industry takes us as holes with a W, W-H-O-L-E-S. It shores up, it reconstructs a psychic entity that is false and rigid and fixed, but people are desperate for. It's a rigid, fixed self that, of course, is very different from any kind of psychoanalytic type understanding. But the explosion of these, especially at the moment, apparently sales of mindfulness books and self-help books have been flying off the internet shelves in the last while. It obviously, as is, it's a very mixed thing, isn't it? The attention to mental health issues in the current state, pandemic state. On the one hand, it's a huge distraction from the real material geopolitical crisis of inequality and oppression that's happening. And on the other, it's put mental questions of people's emotional states and stress and distress very high up some people's agendas. So I think it's going to be mixed in its effects, and I think that the self-help industry, I have my suspicions about who benefits from it. I think a lot of the stuff makes me pretty nauseated. But am I to say how people read it and what they get from it? And, one person's self-help might be somebody else's psychoanalysis.
And I'm particularly grateful that you mentioned earlier, like the e-mental health or the online psychotherapy, because I recognize that this is like a huge topic right now. We are all thrown into this. We have been talking about this like on an academic level for years, but suddenly it's really happening, right?
Mm.
Gordana Jovanovic has a question. She says,
hello, Gordana.
Thank you, Erica, very much. Some thoughts while waiting for a revolution. Did not social distancing start long before this pandemic, as well as a mass habituation to it in forms of radical individualism, naturalism, ahistorism? I think it is important to distinguish between social and societal, because reduction of societal to social prevents radical changes. More
reduction of
question.
Sorry, that's a comment, not a question, is it?
Probably, but maybe you would like to.
The reduction of the societal to the social.
Exactly. And the question whether the social distancing hasn't actually started long before this pandemic.
Well, of course it has. You know, social distancing in some sense, in terms of the convenient segregation of the privileged and the not so privileged, so that people don't need to see deprivation, that if they don't actually have to inhabit it and are never aware. That's, you know, that's part of our unequal and our unequal societies. That's why, you know, all these studies about how the rich really have no idea about the lives of the poor, although the poor know quite a bit about the lives of the rich, mainly because they service them. So, of course, you know, this weird vocabulary that we have now acquired, you know, whole new sets of terms that rename, but also reproduce pre-existing dynamics, in the same way as, you know, the situation that we're in now is, you know, has never happened before, but is doing everything that was happening before again, but worse. I don't know, I'm not sure, in terms of Gordana's point about the reduction of the societal to the social, I'm not sure what's at stake in the use of the different terms. So it would be, maybe we'll have to have an email conversation about that after, if we can't talk about that directly. But I think I agree with the direction of the comment.
Isabel asks, or also says, it's not much of a question, but I just wanted to say that I identify with the sense of paralysis and the sense that everything has changed, but that this separation breeds a sense of impotence that is so convenient to those who oppress us. I wonder how to handle this, how to move beyond treating the other as a threat to our lives. So the identification with the other, and the great fear that is both real and grounded and also keeps us apart, right? So how to be present with the other.
Yeah, how to be present with the other that is, of course, always within us too. I mean, I think the paralysis is partly, it's that bit in Fanon that one can really identify with, about managing the suppressed rage and frustration, and then it's so easy for that to be projected elsewhere. I mean, it's in the longer version of my paper, but you know, a few weeks ago when I was at a greengrocer's, socially distancing, beginning to socially distance to buy my vegetables outside, and this woman, an older woman, older than me, kind of was managing to do this too, and she said, "Oh, we're all enemies now." And it was such an interesting way of commenting on, acknowledging, but also dismantling that sense of threat. I mean, it felt like her saying that was an assertion of some common shared social subjectivity that actually undid some of that sense of threat. And we have to find ways of doing that all the time, as well as being reminded that, you know, of the existence of other people as full social subjects that we reciprocally relate to, that we're in danger of kind of, I mean, this is where the difference between the small group and the medium group and the large group, I think, is important. That in between one's intimate relations, we may or may be in contact with directly or virtually right now, and the very large group, the nation, the collective, there are specific others that we relate to. And if we are moving around at all outside our domestic spaces, that recapitulate and our opportunities to reforge our relation with others as a social bond rather than a social threat. And I think that's what I was trying to get into in identifying these different models of subjectivity. And it's not just about vision. It is about movement and action together, reciprocally, and that we need the other to make ourselves.
Thank you. You only mentioned it or talked about briefly in the beginning of your talk, but it kind of connects to what we've discussed earlier today at Amia Lieblich's talk. You were talking about the medical and the care sphere in the context of the COVID-19. So we've seen the public clapping for care workers, somewhat concerted. And I was wondering how we deal with the fact that several groups within our society, care workers, for example, you mentioned, older adults, often marginalized group, invisible so far, suddenly appear in the public discourse, but as vulnerable victims, prone to the most danger of our times, kind of, and that they need to be protected by us. Like there is an us and a they, right? So the other needs to be protected. And this is, for example, the care workers and the older adults. And we haven't discussed that there are many older adults who have been feeling alone and isolated for a long time, and a large number of older women affected by poverty. And we somehow did not realize, you mentioned that in your talk, that there's always been triage as a measure in intensive care, medical treatment, right? In the war, in countries where healthcare is not easily accessible. So I wonder, what are the long-term consequences that the public discourse about particular marginalized group is one of victimization? So what can we do, given that we know this goes along the lines of age and class and gender?
Oh, well, you're right. I mean, you know, so-called civilized societies are supposed to protect their vulnerable. And what's clear is that you know, that underlying the government thinking is a kind of eugenic discourse of some kind, where the vulnerable can be sacrificed. In this case, the vulnerable are not children, but the elderly and the physically challenged, and it is appalling. It is appalling, and you know, it's very interesting, the silence on kind of advocacy for older groups in you know, the dominant narrative, almost exclusive, the only narrative has been about shielding, protecting, as you say, and very little about rights. Though there has been some coverage of how the older people, some of the, well, there've been very high rates of suicide generally under the lockdown, and some older people have said very clearly that they would rather, they're not interested in protecting themselves physically. They want contact with people and their loved ones. So it's all unraveling. I mean, it's all completely incoherent anyway. And we can see the hypocrisies in who is able to break those supposed quarantine rules and who isn't. You know, which aeroplanes, you know, are allowed to fly where they like and land where they like without any restriction, and which ones aren't.
Thank you so much. We are already at the end of our time of the discussion. Time passed by really quickly, and there's several questions left from the audience. I would like to put onto our Slack. We have a conference Slack, and I would like to invite all of you to keep discussing these questions, and maybe Erica, you would also like to join us. I would be happy about that. Thank you very much for your very insightful and wonderful talk, and all the best.
Thank you, and you.
Goodbye.